Hello! Welcome. Welcome. Sunday night, Monday morning, Monday afternoon. It's a time zone for you.
During a routine checkup at the hospital, my mom stepped out to talk to the doctor. My dad leaned in and whispered, "If they ask about the bruises, say you fell." I was 10. That night, I checked the records. The next morning, I called child services. So there I was, 10 years old, and sitting in that sterile hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. My mom had stepped out to talk to Dr. Williams about my latest injuries, and the silence between my dad and me felt heavier than the cast on my left arm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, and I remember thinking how everything in that room looked the color of old teeth. That's when my dad leaned in close, his breath reeking of the morning coffee he'd been nursing since we left the house. His voice dropped to this urgent whisper that made my skin crawl even before I understood what he was saying. The words hit me like ice water. If anyone asked about the bruises scattered across my ribs and back, I was supposed to say I fell down the stairs. Again, the same lie we'd been spinning for months. The same story that had become as familiar as my own name. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the way his eyes darted toward the door, or how his hands shook slightly as he gripped my shoulder too tight. There was fear there, real terror lurking behind his usual commanding presence. For the first time in my life, I realized my dad wasn't some untouchable giant. He was just a man who was scared of getting caught. The moment stretched between us like a tightrope, and I found myself nodding automatically, the way I'd been trained to do. But inside my head, gears were turning that had never moved before. Questions bubbled up like poison. Why did we need a story if I really had fallen? Why did the bruises on my back look like fingerprints? Why did my mom always leave the room when doctors asked about my injuries? When Dr. Williams returned with my mother trailing behind him, everything looked the same, but felt completely different. The doctor's kind eyes, my mother's worried expression, my father's protective stance. It was all performance now. A carefully choreographed dance I'd been part of without even knowing it. The bruises throbbed under my shirt as if they were trying to speak for themselves, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming the truth right there in that antiseptic room. Dr. Williams asked his routine questions about how I'd gotten hurt, and I watched my parents seamlessly deliver their rehearsed responses. My father's voice carried just the right amount of parental concern mixed with mild exasperation about having such a clumsy child. My mother added details about how I'd been rushing downstairs to watch cartoons when I supposedly tripped and tumbled. They were so smooth, so practiced, that I almost believed them myself for a moment. But then Dr. Williams did something unexpected. He asked to speak with me alone, sending my parents to the waiting room with promises that it would only take a few minutes. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence. The doctor pulled up a chair next to my hospital bed and looked at me with eyes that seemed to see everything. He didn't ask about the fall directly. Instead, he talked about how sometimes kids got hurt in ways that weren't their fault, how there were people whose job it was to help children who were scared or in danger. He spoke in this gentle, non-threatening way that made me want to tell him everything, but the fear was too strong. My father's whispered instructions echoed in my head like a curse, and I stuck to the story about falling downstairs. The drive home was tense in a way I'd never experienced before. My parents spoke in clipped, careful sentences about stopping for groceries and picking up my prescription medication. But underneath their mundane conversation, I could feel electricity crackling like a storm about to break. My father kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, and each look felt like a question. Did you say anything? Did you tell him what really happened? That night, after my parents thought I was asleep, I crept downstairs to our home office. My dad kept everything in there: bills, insurance papers, medical records. The filing cabinet wasn't even locked because who would a 10-year-old want with boring adult paperwork? But I wasn't interested in boring paperwork anymore. I was looking for proof of something I couldn't quite name yet. The medical files painted a picture that made my stomach turn. Emergency room visits every few months for the past 3 years. Broken bones, bruises, cuts that required stitches. The explanations were always the same: clumsy child, frequent falls, sports injuries. But the pattern was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. The injuries escalated during times when my dad was unemployed or drinking more than usual. They clustered around holidays and family gatherings when stress ran high in our house. But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. Hidden behind the medical files was a manila folder labeled insurance claims that contained something that made my blood freeze. There were photographs, dozens of them, showing my injuries from different angles, with dates and detailed descriptions written in my father's handwriting. He'd been documenting everything, creating his own evidence file to support the lies he told doctors and insurance companies. The photographs went back further than I remembered being hurt. There were pictures of bruises on a much younger version of myself, injuries I had no memory of sustaining. Some showed me sleeping, unconscious, with fresh marks on my arms and legs. Others captured me crying, with timestamp data showing they'd been taken immediately after whatever had caused the injuries. My father had been collecting trophies of his abuse like some kind of sick hobby. There were other documents too, correspondence with our insurance company, notes from school nurses, even a letter from our neighbor asking if everything was okay at home. My parents had responses for everything, explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface but felt hollow when you read them all together. They'd been building this elaborate fiction for years, and I'd been the unwitting star of their twisted show. The most disturbing discovery was a handwritten journal in my father's careful script. Page after page detailed his techniques for disciplining children without leaving obvious evidence, ways to inflict maximum pain while minimizing visible marks. He wrote about pressure points that hurt intensely but healed quickly, household items that could be used as weapons without raising suspicion, methods for terrorizing children into compliance without neighbors hearing screams. But the journal revealed something even more sinister. My father wasn't working alone. There were references to other parents, meetings where they shared techniques, even a points system where they rated different methods of abuse based on effectiveness and discretion. Names and addresses were scattered throughout the pages, suggesting a network of families involved in systematic child torture disguised as strict parenting. By the time I climbed back upstairs, something fundamental had shifted inside me. The child who had descended those steps was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that the people meant to protect you could be the ones hurting you most. Sleep didn't come that night, and when morning finally arrived, I knew exactly what I had to do. But I also knew that making that phone call would unleash forces beyond anything my 10-year-old mind could fully comprehend. The next morning felt like walking through quicksand. Every movement was deliberate, every breath calculated. My parents went through their usual routine, Mom making breakfast while humming off-key, Dad reading the newspaper and complaining about politics. They had no idea that their 10-year-old son had just discovered their darkest secret, that the carefully constructed world they'd built was about to come crashing down around them. I waited until they both left for work, my dad to his construction job and my mom to her position at the bank. The house felt different when they were gone, like it could finally exhale after holding its breath all morning. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the yellow rotary phone mounted on the wall, trying to work up the courage to do something that would change all our lives forever. But before I could dial, something made me pause. In my father's journal, I'd seen references to other children, other families. If I was going to blow the whistle on this whole operation, I needed more than just my own story. I needed names, addresses, evidence that would expose the entire network. So instead of calling child services immediately, I made a different choice that would prove far more dangerous. I went back to the home office and photographed every page of my father's journal with our Polaroid camera. Each flash seemed impossibly loud in the empty house, and I kept expecting neighbors to come running to investigate the noise. The pictures weren't perfect, some were blurry, others cut off crucial details, but they captured enough to show the scope of what my father and his associates had been doing. The addresses in the journal led me to make the most reckless decision of my young life. I decided to visit one of the houses mentioned, to see if I could find evidence of other children being hurt. The house was only 6 blocks away, in a neighborhood that looked exactly like ours. Neat lawns, white picket fences, the kind of place where horrible secrets could hide behind perfect facades. I rode my bike over there, telling myself I was just going to look, maybe peek through windows to see if there were kids inside who looked as scared and beaten down as I felt. But when I got to the house, I found something that changed everything. The front door was slightly open, and I could hear crying coming from inside. Not the normal crying of a frustrated child, but the desperate sobbing of someone in real pain. Without thinking, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was laid out just like ours, but it felt colder, more sterile. The crying was coming from upstairs, and I found myself climbing the steps even though every instinct screamed at me to run. At the top of the stairs, I discovered a boy about my age locked in what looked like a bedroom, but felt more like a prison cell. The room had been stripped of anything that could be used as a weapon or comfort. No toys, no books, no decorations on the walls. Just a mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, and a small window that had been nailed shut. The boy, I later learned his name was Alex, was covered in bruises that made mine look minor. Some were fresh and angry. Others had faded to sickly yellows and greens that suggested weeks of systematic torture. Alex was terrified when he first saw me, cowering in the corner like a beaten animal. But when I showed him the photographs from my father's journal, when I explained that I knew what was happening to him because the same thing was happening to me, something shifted in his expression. For the first time, he wasn't alone with his secret. For the first time, someone believed him. That's when we heard the car in the driveway. Alex's eyes went wide with panic, and he whispered that his parents weren't supposed to be home for hours. We were trapped upstairs with no way out except through the front door, where whoever was arriving would see us immediately. The sound of keys jingling sent us both into full panic mode, and I realized that my impulsive investigation had put both of us in mortal danger. But then something incredible happened. Instead of Alex's parents, 2 police officers walked through the front door. They'd been conducting their own investigation based on an anonymous tip, and they'd come to the house expecting to find evidence of child abuse. What they found instead was 2 terrified kids with stories that corroborated everything they'd suspected about the network of abusive parents operating in our community. The officers, Detective Morrison and his partner Detective Foster, handled the situation with incredible care. They photographed Alex's injuries, documented the prison-like conditions of his room, and collected evidence that would later prove crucial in prosecuting not just his parents, but the entire network. More importantly, they listened to our stories with the kind of serious attention that made us feel like our experiences mattered. That's when I learned the most shocking twist of all. The anonymous tip that had brought the police to Alex's house had come from my own mother. She'd found my father's journal after I'd left it out in my rush to photograph it, and instead of covering for him like she'd done for years, she'd decided to turn him in. The woman I'd thought was a passive victim of my father's violence had actually been gathering evidence against him for months, waiting for the right moment to act. The police took both Alex and me into protective custody that afternoon, but not before we'd helped them identify 6 other houses from my father's journal. By evening, they'd rescued 4 more children and arrested 8 adults on charges ranging from child abuse to criminal conspiracy. What had started as one 10-year-old's desperate phone call had become the largest child abuse investigation in our county's history. But the most mind-blowing revelation was still to come. As we sat in the police station giving our statements, Detective Morrison received a call that made his face go pale. The investigation had attracted the attention of federal authorities because the network of abusive parents extended across state lines. We weren't just dealing with a local problem. We'd uncovered a sophisticated criminal organization that had been operating for years, sharing techniques and covering for each other's crimes. The federal investigation transformed our quiet suburban community into a media circus overnight. News vans lined our street. Reporters shoved microphones at anyone willing to talk, and helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures. The story had everything journalists loved: innocent children, trusted community members leading double lives, and a conspiracy that reached into multiple states. But the media attention brought unexpected consequences. Within hours of the first news broadcast, the FBI hotline was flooded with calls from children across the country who recognized the patterns we'd described. It turned out that the network my father had been part of was just one cell in a much larger organization. They called themselves the Disciplinarians, and they had chapters in over 20 states, all connected through encrypted online forums and secret meetings disguised as parenting seminars. The FBI agents who took over the case, Agent Rodriguez and Agent Thompson, were unlike anyone I'd ever met. They treated me and the other rescued children like we were valuable witnesses rather than damaged goods. They explained that our testimonies would be crucial in dismantling an organization that had been operating for over a decade, hurting hundreds of children while maintaining perfect facades of respectability. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. The disciplinarians had infiltrated school districts, social services departments, even law enforcement agencies. They'd placed their members in positions where they could identify vulnerable families and recruit new members. They had protocols for discrediting children who tried to report abuse, systems for relocating families when investigations got too close, and backup plans for destroying evidence if their network was ever exposed. My father, it turned out, wasn't just a member of the disciplinarians, he was a regional coordinator. His job was to train new members, develop new techniques for inflicting pain without leaving evidence, and maintain the network's security protocols. The journal I'd found wasn't just his personal record. It was a training manual that had been distributed to cells across the country. My discovery had given law enforcement the blueprint for the entire organization. But the investigation revealed an even more disturbing truth. The disciplinarians weren't just abusing their own children. They were trafficking kids between families, lending them out for punishment sessions, and in some cases selling them to members who wanted to experiment with new torture techniques. Some children had been moved so many times they couldn't remember their original families. Others had been brainwashed so thoroughly they defended their abusers even after being rescued. The psychological evaluations that followed were like descending into hell. Trained therapists worked with each rescued child to uncover the full extent of their trauma, but what they found defied comprehension. Children who'd been conditioned to hurt other children as part of their punishment. Kids who'd been forced to participate in the abuse of their siblings to protect them from worse treatment. Families where parents had been convinced that extreme physical discipline was the only way to raise successful, obedient children. The most shocking revelation came when investigators analyzed the organization's financial records. The disciplinarians had been funding their activities through a network of legitimate businesses, daycare centers, youth camps, even children's charities. Parents would pay membership fees disguised as donations to these organizations, and in return they'd receive training materials, access to like-minded families, and protection from law enforcement investigations. Some of the businesses were generating millions of dollars in revenue while serving as fronts for organized child abuse. The daycare centers were particularly sinister. They provided cover for identifying new victims and recruitment opportunities for expanding the network. Parents who brought their children to these facilities would be gradually introduced to the disciplinarian's philosophy, starting with seemingly reasonable discussions about the importance of strict discipline and escalating to participation in actual abuse. My mother's role in all this proved to be more complex than anyone had initially understood. She hadn't just been a passive victim. She'd been an active member of the organization, though she'd been working as a double agent for the better part of a year. Her position at the bank had given her access to the financial records that exposed the money laundering operation, and she'd been secretly copying documents and building a case against the entire network. The reason she'd never protected me from my father's abuse wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. She'd realized that removing me from the situation would only result in us being relocated to another cell where the abuse would continue, and she'd lose her access to evidence. Instead, she'd endured watching her son suffer while gathering the information needed to destroy the entire organization. It was a terrible calculus that had required sacrificing my immediate safety for the chance to save hundreds of other children. The trial preparation was unlike anything the legal system had ever handled. With over 300 defendants across 20 states, prosecutors had to develop new strategies for managing what was essentially the largest organized crime case in American history. The evidence filled warehouses, thousands of photographs, hours of video recordings, financial documents that traced money flows across international borders, and testimony from hundreds of victims spanning multiple generations. During the preparation phase, investigators made another disturbing discovery. The disciplinarians hadn't just been operating in the United States. They had connections to similar organizations in Europe, Asia, and South America. What we thought was a domestic child abuse network was actually part of a global criminal enterprise that trafficked children, produced and distributed child abuse materials, and provided services to wealthy predators who paid premium prices for access to victims. The international connections explained how the organization had managed to operate for so long without detection. When investigations got too close in one country, members would relocate to another. Children would be moved across borders using falsified documents, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement agencies to track them. The sophisticated encryption and communication protocols made it difficult for authorities to monitor their activities even when they suspected something was wrong. But perhaps the most mind-blowing aspect of the investigation was discovering how many respected community members had been involved. The list of defendants read like a who's who of local leadership: teachers, coaches, religious leaders, police officers, judges, social workers, and politicians. These were people who'd built their careers on protecting children, all while participating in their systematic abuse and exploitation. The trials began 18 months after my phone call, and they would continue for the next 3 years. The prosecution team included attorneys from 12 different jurisdictions, FBI agents, international law enforcement, and specialists in organized crime. The courtroom was converted to accommodate the massive amount of evidence and the security requirements for protecting hundreds of witnesses, many of whom were children testifying against their own parents. My testimony came early in the proceedings, and it lasted for 4 days. The prosecutors walked me through every detail of my abuse, using medical records, photographs, and my father's own journal entries to build their case. But they also had me explain how I discovered the network, how I'd found Alex, and how my actions had led to uncovering the entire conspiracy. The defense attorneys tried to paint me as a confused child who'd been manipulated by investigators, but the physical evidence was overwhelming. The most dramatic moment of my testimony came when they brought my father into the courtroom. I hadn't seen him since the day of his arrest, and I was shocked by how much he'd changed. The confident, terrifying man I remembered had been replaced by someone who looked small and defeated. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I felt something I'd never expected: pity. He'd built his entire identity around power and control, and now he was just another criminal in an orange jumpsuit. But my father's appearance was nothing compared to what happened when Alex took the stand. His testimony revealed details about the organization that even the FBI hadn't uncovered. He'd been trafficked between multiple families, forced to participate in training sessions where new members practiced their techniques on him, and used as a reward for members who'd successfully recruited new participants. His matter-of-fact description of horrors that would traumatize adults was both heartbreaking and incredibly powerful evidence. The defense strategy across all the trials was remarkably consistent. They portrayed the disciplinarians as a misunderstood parenting support group that had been infiltrated by a few bad actors. They argued that most members were well-meaning parents who'd been misled by extremist elements within the organization. Some defendants claimed they'd thought they were participating in legitimate research on child development and behavior modification. But the prosecution had evidence that demolished these defenses. They had recordings of training sessions where members discussed the best ways to terrorize children into submission. They had financial records showing payments for children being trafficked between families. Most damaging, they had the testimony of children who could identify multiple defendants and describe in detail what each person had done to them. The international aspect of the case led to some of the most shocking revelations. Several defendants had been involved in producing materials that were distributed globally through encrypted networks. Others had participated in trafficking operations that moved children across multiple continents. The organization had connections to similar groups in countries where law enforcement was less sophisticated, creating a global marketplace for child abuse that generated millions of dollars in revenue. As the trials progressed, more victims continued to come forward. Some were adults who'd been abused as children decades earlier but had never spoken about their experiences. Others were teenagers who'd aged out of the network but had been too traumatized or brainwashed to seek help. Each new testimony added another piece to the puzzle, revealing the true scope of an organization that had been operating like a shadow government within normal society. The sentences were unprecedented. My father received life in prison without the possibility of parole, as did 17 other regional coordinators. Lower-level members received sentences ranging from 20 to 50 years, depending on their level of involvement and the severity of their crimes. Several defendants died by suicide before their trials concluded, unable to face the consequences of their actions or the complete destruction of their public reputations. My mother's situation was more complicated. Her cooperation with law enforcement had been crucial to exposing the network, but she'd also been complicit in years of abuse. The prosecutors offered her a plea deal: 10 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 7, plus lifetime supervision and mandatory counseling. She accepted the deal and testified against dozens of her former associates, providing details that led to additional arrests and convictions. The civil lawsuits that followed the criminal trials created another layer of accountability. Families of victims sued not just the individual perpetrators, but also the businesses that had served as fronts for the organization. The daycare centers, youth camps, and charities were forced to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. Several insurance companies that had covered these businesses also faced massive payouts, leading to industry-wide changes in how they evaluated risk for organizations serving children. The psychological impact on the rescued children varied dramatically. Some, like Alex and me, were able to work through our trauma with intensive therapy and supportive foster families. Others struggled with severe mental health issues that would require lifelong treatment. A few couldn't adapt to normal family life and ended up in specialized residential facilities designed for children with extreme trauma histories. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on child protection systems across the country. The disciplinarian's case led to major reforms in how abuse investigations were conducted, how evidence was collected and preserved, and how different agencies cooperated with each other. New protocols were established for identifying organized abuse networks, and training programs were developed to help professionals recognize signs that individual cases might be part of larger conspiracies. The case also led to changes in how online platforms monitored for criminal activity. The encrypted forums that the disciplinarians had used were shut down, and new technologies were developed to identify similar networks before they could become established. International cooperation agreements were strengthened to prevent criminals from escaping prosecution by fleeing to countries with weaker law enforcement. 10 years later, I'm now 20 and studying criminal justice in college. My goal is to work for the FBI, specifically in their unit that investigates crimes against children. The experiences that nearly destroyed me as a child have become the foundation for a career dedicated to protecting other kids from similar horrors. Alex is studying computer science with a focus on cybersecurity, using his technical skills to help law enforcement track down online predators. The house where I grew up has been torn down and replaced with a small park dedicated to the victims of the disciplinarians. There's a plaque that lists the names of all the children who were rescued, along with a quote that has become something of a motto for survivors. Sometimes the bravest thing a child can do is refuse to keep an adult's terrible secret. Every year on the anniversary of the first arrests, survivors and their families gather there to remember what we survived and to honor those who didn't make it through their ordeals. My relationship with my mother remains complicated. She's been out of prison for 2 years now, and we meet occasionally for supervised visits. I understand intellectually why she made the choices she did, how her decision to gather evidence rather than immediately protect me ultimately saved hundreds of other children. But emotionally, it's harder to forgive someone who watched you suffer even if it was for a greater good. Therapy helps, but some wounds take longer to heal than others. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that evil often hides behind facades of respectability and normalcy. The people who hurt me weren't monsters lurking in dark alleys. They were teachers and coaches and neighbors who everyone thought were pillars of the community. They attended church, volunteered for charity, and maintained perfect lawns and friendly smiles. The abuse happened in houses that looked exactly like every other house on the street, hidden behind closed doors and enforced silence. But I also learned that one person speaking truth can bring down even the most sophisticated criminal organization. My 10-year-old self couldn't have imagined that picking up a phone would lead to arrests in 20 states and reforms that protect children across the country. Sometimes the smallest act of courage can have consequences that ripple outward in ways you never expected, touching lives you'll never meet and preventing suffering you'll never see. The final twist in this story came just last year, when investigators discovered that the disciplinarians had been planning something called the Final Discipline, a mass event where they intended to eliminate all the children in their network to prevent them from ever testifying against the organization. My phone call didn't just save me and the kids we rescued immediately. It prevented what would have been the largest mass murder of children in American history. Sometimes you don't realize you're a hero until years later, when you finally understand the true scope of what your actions prevented. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.